Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Like all of you, I certainly have been enjoying this lovely spring that we're having in the upper Midwest. So thank you for braving the elements today. Welcome to another installment of the Terrence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy, and the ongoing Hot Topics series. Today, we take up the question, should the U.S. tax system be used as a tool to address income inequality? And it's great to see a full house today. Catholic social teaching has been described as one of the best kept secrets of the Catholic faith. And I should probably say who I am. Father Dan Griffith. I am a faculty fellow here at the law school and chaplain and fellow of the Murphy Institute. So very happy to be with you. Also a priest of the Archdiocese and pastor of Our Lady of Lourdes across the river here in Minneapolis. Catholic social teaching has been described as one of the best kept secrets of the Catholic faith because its vision and principles are largely unknown by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. The Murphy Institute does a good job to try to balance that out and of trying to present Catholic social thought in a way that is intelligible and in a way that can be thoughtfully applied to contemporary social issues. In the encyclical Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, Pope Benedict XVI teaches that the Catholic Church has an important role to play in offering her Catholic social teaching. He says that we should not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice. This role, he says, is to propose principles and purify reason in the attainment of justice. Pope Benedict also states in this document that the ministry of justice and charity is as integral to the nature and mission of the Church as celebrating the sacraments and preaching the gospel. Let that sink in for a minute. That's a provocative thing, and I believe it's true, right? A provocative truth, that the Church serves through justice and charity, and it's as integral to her nature as those other two dimensions. St. Francis would say this is how we best preach the gospel, through acts of charity and justice. Catholic social teaching communicates objective principles which find their source in Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience toward the goal of promoting the common good and fostering authentic human flourishing for all in our society. A critical dimension to Catholic social thought, sometimes missed, is that while the Church offers objective principles, dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and others, it notes that when applied to subjective situations, people of goodwill may disagree on how best to promote a more just and humane social order. The example that some point to is the collective judgment of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops that the last Iraq war was unjust. It didn't meet the requirements of a just war, but the bishops said something very important. They said, our judgment is not binding on the conscience of Catholics because people of goodwill might arrive at a different conclusion using the same teaching. So what this means is that what means are most effective in bringing about a particular goal may be a point of disagreement among those engaging in thoughtful dialogue. Now to our issue at hand. Many have been concerned in our American society and throughout the world with the growing disparity of wealth and income, and all of the issues that attend to this widening gap. Certainly, Pope Francis has vigorously exercised his prophetic ministry in decrying these widening disparities, something that he would argue is an affront to justice. Our question today is whether the U.S. tax system should be used as a tool to address income inequality. And with us for this conversation are two excellent scholars, two people of goodwill, who have thought about these issues and will share their thinking with us today. I'd like to first introduce Dr. Robert Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is a professor of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas and has chaired the department for the last decade. He now has some time to get back into more scholarship and has a recent book just published, or will be published, Justice in Taxation, 2018, where he takes up some of these issues. So we welcome Dr. Kennedy, who has written and presented extensively in the area of Catholic social teaching and its relation to societal issues. Our other presenter is Professor Scott Taylor, a senior distinguished fellow of the University of St. Thomas School of Law. Scott's scholarship, Professor Taylor's scholarship, is wide-ranging and includes articles on the taxation of captive insurance, integration of the corporate income tax, and taxation in Indian country, taxation of Indian gaming, and innovations in legal education. Prior to his presence here on the faculty of the law school at St. Thomas, Professor Taylor taught at the University of New Mexico School of Law for 20 years. And now to our format. Professor Taylor will begin arguing in the affirmative and will take between 8 to 10 minutes. A student timer will give each presenter a visible 2-minute warning, discreetly but clearly. And will stand up, I guess less discreetly, at 10 minutes. Well, he's right here, so he may not need to stand up. Then each speaker will have 5 minutes to respond to the presentation of their dialogue partner today. We also want to hear from you. So you have in your places a card where you can write questions, and we will collect those at the end of the presentations and put those questions to our presenters today. If the presenters would like to waive their 5-minute period and get right to the questions, they're welcome to do that or take half the time, whatever they would like to do. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished presenters today.
Minimize?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there you are. You're there.
Thank you, Father Griffith, for that nice introduction, and my gratitude to Bob Kennedy as well. I think it was in this room that we last time met and we had a conversation about same-sex marriage. And so I remember it quite well. My position is that in response to the question, should the U.S. tax system be used as a tool to address income inequality? And I tried to express my enthusiasm for that proposition with 2 exclamation points. I should have added a smiley face because that's a good thing as well. From my point of view, income inequality is probably the biggest challenge to humanity, and it's a multi-millennia challenge. And I will have included here resources that will end up establishing that. The Gini coefficient is what economists use to measure income inequality. So to give you a little bit of context for the 2 slides that are coming up, 0 means complete inequality, and 1.0 means complete inequality. That's where I guess one person has all the income and all the wealth. So starting from a global perspective, it's a little hard to see the notations on the bottom. But if you look at where Finland is, actually it's Sweden. If you look at Sweden, it has the lowest Gini score, closest to 0, and so it has, in the world, it's #1 in terms of low income inequality. From my point of view, low income inequality is good because high income inequality is extremely bad. It's very bad for society, and I'll try to establish that with my slides. So with the United States, there you can see the score over on the side. And generally speaking, dark blue is high income inequality, and lighter colors, light blue, gray, orange, and light orange are better. If you look at Minnesota, you'll see that Minnesota, compared to many other regions of the country, is relatively good in terms of income inequality. And we'll learn that Minnesota is one of the many states that has its own form of the earned income tax credit, so it adds to the robustness of the federal earned income tax credit, which is the mechanism by which we use the current federal income tax system to redistribute income in a major way. I start out with a fairly linear argument, which is that income inequality creates harms, and the harms are riots, rebellions, revolutions, wars, and plagues. And it's interesting, they have emojis now for riots. And so the emoji for a riot is someone in a gas mask. So I don't know if it's the rioter or the anti-riot authorities who are wearing the gas mask. I guess to be on the safe side, it's probably both. And then rebellions, I have a raised fist. And for revolutions, I have the guillotine. And we'll be getting to the French Revolution in a moment as something that was the result of income inequality. Plagues as well, according to new scholarship, is a result of income inequality. So the little logo there is actually the plague doctor from medieval times, when income inequality was associated with plagues. I ran out of space on this page, but the next one was going to be famine. And I could have had a logo of someone's skin and bones. That would have been famine. So this is the most recent scholarship on income inequality, and it establishes that it's a millennium problem. And I recommend that you take a look at the book. It's I actually don't think it's provocative. I think it's fairly straightforward in establishing an historical record, establishing that income inequality and violence go hand in hand. And so income inequality is a social evil in the sense that it creates these harms that I'm talking about. So, at least in the United States, the first instance I found of income inequality disorder were the New York City riots. They were associated with the draft during the Civil War, and essentially poor working Irish immigrants were upset that they were being drafted while wealthy people could buy out of the draft. And this is actually the case in many riots, that it's something that you don't necessarily think is going to provoke a riot. But if you look at it, this was 5 days of unrest and many, many hundreds of people who were killed in the rioting. This is the most recent one, the London income inequality riots, which I've renamed. There were two big ones, the Trafalgar Square one and the Brixton one. The Brixton one took place because the Trafalgar Square rioters were put in Brixton prison. So the anti-tax rioters went to Brixton the next time. It had to do with a poll tax, and the poll tax was a per-person tax that was assessed without regard to ability to pay. And the target of the rioters were places that looked to be owned by wealthy people. So it was a fairly large number of people who were really ticked off about being subject to unfair taxation, and that was the London riots. I did have a couple of videos because I've shown that in my tax class, and the videos of the tax riots are actually rather startling, and so we took them out to so you could enjoy your enchiladas. This is the first domestic income inequality rebellion, so I'm moving from riots to rebellions. And in this case, it was the Whiskey Rebellion, and it was essentially took place in Pennsylvania. People were ticked off in Pennsylvania because they were growing wheat and rye, and they were making it into whiskey, which was economically more advantageous for them. And Alexander Hamilton said, well, we have this Revolutionary War debt we have to pay off. We need some tax revenue, so let's put it on the whiskey. Turns out most of the whiskey was being made in Pennsylvania, and we had the Whiskey Rebellion. And then there was Shays Rebellion, which took place before that, had to do with poor farmers who were imposed with real property taxes on their farms, and this was to help Massachusetts pay its share of the Revolutionary War debt. And so we're up to the rebellions, and we'll be getting to the revolutions. The Washington State study, I have the link there, did an archaeological study and establishes that social unrest in terms of income inequality is associated with the archaeological record as well, which is rather interesting. And I found it fascinating how they measured wealth and income and the inequality, and it was mostly graves that they were looking at. And they were finding out in graves how people died, if they died of malnutrition, and wealthy people were often buried with lots of belongings, so you could tell. And their health, at least archaeologically speaking, looked quite a bit better. And income inequality leads to revolution. The best one is the French Revolution. So the question is, do we want to get to the point where people are storming the Bastille? We could cue Les Mis music at this point. Do we really want, even though they're kings and not much liked, so do we want heads to roll because of revolution taking place? And the next question is, can the federal income tax address income inequality in the United States? And the answer is that the political record and the historical record is that this has been going on for quite some time, since 1975. And it's because it's been around so long, scholars have studied the earned income tax credit, and they've looked at what effects it has. And the effects are quite good. It reduces unemployment, it reduces poverty, improves health and education of children, it reduces abortion. And then on a political level, what's really strange is that the United States has experienced a relatively unknown kumbaya moment, which is that in the federal government, both Republicans and Democrats support the earned income tax credit. And in the states, all the colored states, blue and orange, have an earned income tax credit of some shape or form. And it turns out that it is a broad national consensus of 30 jurisdictions. You could win a presidential election with all those states. And so now the question is, if we look at the broad political consensus, we see that President Trump, Paul Ryan, I'm going to point out here that Paul Ryan is a good Catholic from Wisconsin, went to a Catholic high school, and is proud of his Catholic identity. Kevin Brady, Paul Ryan was, when I wrote this, he still was the Speaker of the House, but he no longer is. That often happens to me in terms of tax stories. Things happen all of a sudden. And so with Paul Ryan, he's gone, he's leaving. I actually like him very much. He's a conservative, and I think he's been quite effective. I think he worked legislative miracles with the tax reform. So I see my time's up, so I'm going to go through quickly. And because here's the joke. Paul Ryan explains the EITC to Pope Francis, and that's what Pope Francis thinks. It's a good thing to hear. And then in the bottom part, I have positive quotes from Pope Francis, which would indicate that if he were in the Congress, he'd vote for the EITC. Thank you.
Don't you just love PowerPoint? I've got it. All right, thank you all for being here. Did you know, by the way, that this was going to be about taxation when you came? It's too late now. We've closed the doors, and you're not going to be able to leave. So I appreciate the invitation from the Murphy Institute and Sean's work in organizing this, and I'm happy to be on a platform with Scott again. I'm going to take a somewhat different approach to this question because I really do want to focus on the question of whether it's legitimate to tax households with higher incomes in order to reduce inequality. Deeply embedded in both the Catholic social tradition and the American legal tradition is a presumption in favor of the right of private persons to own property of all sorts. This shouldn't be new to you. Real property, movable property, financial property, intellectual property, and so on. In order to justify any coercive taking by government, this presumption must be overcome, and that's part of the question we have today. Is there a reason to overcome this presumption? Ordinarily, arguments in favor of takings are rooted in the claim that the taking is necessary to establish and sustain the common good of the community. And I'll give you a definition of the common good in a moment. There are some contrary arguments that don't make that claim. Some scholars make the claim that coercive takings are simply thefts. Robert Nozick, Murray Rothbard, for example, are of this position. Others claim that the right to own property is actually a creation of the state, and therefore the state may take some property as it sees fit for its purposes, because the right to own property itself, wouldn't exist without their action, so they can take what they wish. Liam Murphy and Thomas Nagel have probably written the best book about that. With respect to the distribution of income acquired justly and lawfully, so I want to make the point that I'm not talking today about income that might be acquired unlawfully, dishonestly, through fraud or deception or coercion or anything of that sort, but we're assuming that the income is acquired justly and lawfully. Coercive taking by taxation, I think, can be justified only if 4 conditions maintain. First, the distribution of income itself is a sign of serious harm to the common good. Second, voluntary action, choices about donating, spending, investing, and so on, and non-government influences are insufficient to mitigate the harm. Thirdly, non-coercive government action is insufficient to mitigate the harm. And lastly, coercive taking by taxation can, in fact, effectively mitigate the harm without causing other serious harms. So I'm arguing that all 4 of those conditions need to be satisfied if we justify taxing higher income households for the purpose of reducing income inequality. Now, frankly, I'm not sure what the problem is, and I don't mean to confess, well, I guess I do mean to confess some ignorance here. Here are some possible complaints, and maybe later some of you can help me understand more clearly what the problem is. One complaint is that members of Group X, let's call them higher income households, simply have more money that they need or that they can use. Or perhaps they don't deserve to receive the income they have, even if they haven't done anything unjust or unlawful to acquire it. We sometimes think that way about people who inherit money through no good reason of their own, or people who receive money from rents or something of that sort. Or perhaps we think that high-income households don't use their money well, and that civil authorities would make much better use of the money if only they had it available. Or perhaps we think that members of another group, low-income households, need more money to live a minimally decent life. Now, I want to call your attention to the fact that some people have low incomes is not necessarily a direct result of the fact that some people have high incomes. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game. Maybe we can return to that. Perhaps we just think that the income differences are too great. Income should be distributed, earned, received, whatever, more evenly. Or maybe we just dislike the distribution of income. We can't really find a remedy unless we understand what the problem is. I work out of the Catholic social tradition. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a philosopher and a theologian. And so these are some principles that shape the way I think about questions like this. I'm going to go through them very quickly. First of all, the flourishing of human persons is an activity. It's not passivity. A flourishing human person is fully active in thinking clearly, choosing well, and participating as a member of a society. The right of ownership in the Catholic tradition is a natural right. It's not a right, contrary to Murphy and Nagel and others. It's not a right created by the state. It's a right that precedes the state. So it's a right in principle that cannot lawfully, legitimately be suppressed by the state. The state can regulate the right of ownership in support of the common good. We also make a distinction between the right to possess and the right to use. It's one thing to hold something peacefully, and it's another thing to use it any way that you wish. There are obligations that go along with wealth. In the Catholic tradition, we call that the Spider-Man principle. And if you've seen the movies or the stories, with great power comes great responsibility, with great wealth comes great responsibility. We also see a distinction, an important distinction between society and government. Government is an organ of society. Society is much, much larger and has a set of functions and operations that don't belong to government. Government, in fact, is the organ through which society exercises authority in support of the common good. Now, what's the common good? Classic definition in the Catholic tradition is that the common good is a set of conditions, the sum total of conditions of social living whereby men are enabled more fully and more readily to achieve their own perfection. Two things I want you to notice here. First of all, it's an instrumental good. It's a set of conditions. It's not an end to be sought for its own sake. And secondly, it is oriented toward the achievement of flourishing of each person in the community, something that we cannot do for people. We can help them do, but we can't do it to them or for them. Justice. Classic definition, the habit whereby a man renders to each one his due with constant and perpetual will. Distributive justice. I'm skipping over a couple things here. Distributive justice always involves the distribution to members of a community of a resource owned by the community. It never involves the distribution of something owned by private persons by an authority to other private persons. Whatever that is, it's not distributive justice in the proper sense. So here are some questions I think we need to answer. If we're going to answer affirmatively that taxation can and ought to be used to address income inequality, consider me to be an agnostic about that. First, can we show that the unequal distribution of income is itself the sign of serious harm to the common good? We can show that a category of persons who have an insufficient income find life very difficult, and this is a problem for the community. But that's not the same thing as income inequality causing the problem. There may be things we could do to diminish the range of income distribution without actually helping people at the bottom very much at all. Secondly, can we show that voluntary action cannot mitigate whatever harms we identify as caused by income inequality? In 2015, the estimate is that Americans made philanthropic contributions of about $373 million. We paid taxes of about 1.4, a little bit more than $1.4 trillion in that same year. Scott mentioned the earned income tax credit. The philanthropic donations were roughly 6 times the size of the earned income tax credit for that year. Now, even if we would increase the earned income tax credit, it wouldn't do a great deal to change anything about income inequality. We also haven't said anything about the way in which people with greater income use that income. It's a binary problem. It's not just that they have the income. What do they do with the income? Do they give it away? Do they invest it so that other people have jobs? Do they spend it on things that employ other people? Those questions have to be answered as well. Can we show that additional non-coercive government action cannot mitigate the harms? Can we be more imaginative about incentives that would encourage people to spend their money differently? And finally, are we really confident that giving money to Congress and to government agencies would result in much better decisions about how that money is spent to support the common good? That's essentially what we're talking about here. We're talking about changing the group of people who are making the decisions about what to do with the income. If we can't answer all of these questions affirmatively and objectively, then I think we're not justified in using taxation to adjust income inequality. And I'll just leave this up. I have some quotations from Rerum Novarum, an early papal encyclical that has a great deal to say about the right to property and taxation. Thanks very much.
So Sean gave me a good idea in an email this morning, and that was if I wanted to use my 5 minutes for something I hadn't finished, I should feel free to do so. And so I think this is relatively important, and this has to do with if Pope Francis is the Pope, if he has something to say about income inequality and something like the earned income tax credit, is it something that we should listen to? And the quote I have here is from the link. If you want to look at the link is quite interesting because it covers essentially the Bible and other religious traditions and their thoughts about taxation. So in an apostolic exhortation, which this makes clear is not necessarily that of the Roman Catholic Church. So my question to Bob is, why isn't it? He made the statement, I listened, I find the statement to be relatively convincing, and so this is what he had to say. He cited a 4th century saint who said, not to share one's wealth with the poor is to steal from them and take away their livelihood. It is not our own goods which we hold, but theirs. So I think that is contrary to what Bob just said, which is that in a well-ordered society, what happens under the rule of law is if you have lawful income, you should be able to keep it, and you shouldn't be subject to the government taking it away from you. He also suggested that the Pope dismiss those who blame the poor for their poverty, and I think one of the things the earned income tax credit does is it's associated with gainful activity, which is praiseworthy, which is that it's work by the working poor who are trying to get by, and you don't get it unless you're working. And that was one of the welfare reform components of increasing the earned income tax credit, which is instead of creating a handout society ethic, shouldn't it be something that if you earn it, you get it, and if you know ahead of time? And then Bob also mentioned that we don't have evidence of what people do with the earned income tax credit. And I looked at a lot of studies. I didn't quote this because I didn't know what he was going to say until I got here. And so one of the studies indicates that what people do with their earned income tax credit is various. They pay for further education. They pay for school supplies for their children. They pay their bills, so they get out of debt, which is really good because if you're poor, you face a lot of debt because you incur debt to get by. And so I think that that's something that's important to pay attention to. And then this is from Charles E. Curran. He's a formerly from Catholic University, but he's no longer from there anymore. He's from SMU, but he's considered a reliable historian, legal historian, church historian. Chuck Reed tells me so, and then Chuck said that's because he's citing me more often now, and so therefore he's a top quality historian, church historian. And he summarizes that the Catholic Church has said very little about taxation and has been economically conservative. And I think what you just heard from Bob is a reflection of that. Pope Leo XIII warned that the government would act unjustly if it uses confiscatory taxes to destroy property rights. And Pope Pius XI favored proportional taxes and emphasized that they should not be so heavy as to oppress private initiative. That second thought I endorse wholeheartedly. The rate of taxation can get so high that people wonder what's going on. The year I was born, the top marginal rate in the United States was 93%. It's because we were in the process of fighting the Korean War and we had finished World War II, and guess what? Wars are really, really expensive. And so citizens of the United States were at the top marginal rate expected to fork over 93% of their income. Now, it's been indexed for inflation, but actually while I was teaching here, that would have been my rate if it hadn't been indexed for inflation. I would have paid 93% on my marginal income. Thankfully, it's lower now. The top rate is 37%, so should I get income that high, I'm happy to pay 37% as the top marginal rate. 30 seconds left, is it? So,
30 seconds, yeah.
okay. One thing I wanted to point out is that, and this reflects back on a conversation that Bob and Sean and I had, and One thing I said was income inequality is the type of thing that causes political revolutions to take place. Do we really want socialism or communism in the United States? And Bob said something interesting, which was that if people elected representatives in a democratic institutions, they could. And so I think I established that we have a political consensus. Congress is there, the president is there, most of the states are there. And so this is something where the consent of the governed, no taxation without representation. We've had a lot of representation, and our representatives has decided that this is what we should have.
Thank you, Scott. I'm just quickly going to respond to a couple of things here. First of all, please note that there's a difference between using tax revenues to relieve the distress of households with a lower income and using tax revenues for the express purpose of reducing the range of income inequality in the country. We can do one or the other without affecting the other. And I would argue that we're not taxing, well, too much. We're not taxing too much to reduce, as an objective, to reduce income inequality. In fact, the proportion of income earned by the top 1%, to which most college professors belong, by the way, so you may see this as self-serving. The proportion of income earned by the top 1% and the top 10% has actually grown a little bit in recent years. So if we are taxing to reduce income inequality, it's not working very well. I have nothing to say about the earned income tax credit. I didn't say anything about how people spend that. I'm not objecting to that. It's an entirely different question from whether we ought to be reducing income inequality. Raising some portion of the population in order to help their distress is not the same thing as targeting income inequality. It's also the case that it's not the position of the Catholic Church, which robustly defends the right of ownership. It's not the position of the church to say that you have no duties with respect to what you own. In fact, that's quite contrary to the position of the church. If you own things, especially if you own a great deal, you have very solemn responsibilities to use that well and to use it for the common good. Popes have spoken about using superfluous income and superfluous wealth as a solemn responsibility in service of the common good. So let's leave it at that, and I'm happy to move to the question and answer period.
First question to Professor Taylor is how much inequality can be tolerated in society? One of the things that the U.S. bishops taught in 1986 in the document Economic Justice for All is there will always be income inequality, and not only is some of that to be tolerated, in some cases it's to be preferred economically. And then the question, to conflate a couple questions here, is are you looking for something similar to Finland that has a certain, it's not our capitalist way of looking at the economy. It's a very different understanding of the social order. So if you could comment on how much inequality is permissible, and are you advocating something like Finland or something on the order that we have now, or more progressive?
Thank you very much. There is some question about when do things start exploding when you have serious income inequality. And some of the scholars are saying that the United States is very close to that point. And I asked myself, well, given the amount of income inequality we have in the historical record, that riots occur, rebellion occur, civil wars occur, revolutions occur, famines occur. When are we going to get at that point? So the Washington State study said that we're already at the point, we, the United States, in terms of our income inequality, we're already at the point that various civilizations were just at the time that they exploded. And so I don't want to alarm anyone. I think the mistake that they were making, based on the research I looked at, is that actually what I'm relying on is the CIA fact book. And the CIA fact book, which is published, I think, every other year, it does give the Gini scores of all the countries in the world. And the United States is substantially lower than, according to the CIA, than the Washington State study, which is saying that we're at approximately 0.8, which is way above where things were exploding, such as in France with the French Revolution. And in terms of Finland, what's kind of interesting is that my grandfather was from Finland, and I've been to Finland, and Finland is a very happy place. They do have outstanding education. They spend a lot of money on education. Their workforce is extremely well educated. It's also a very entrepreneurial place, and it's, do I want us to go where Finland is? And I think the answer is we'd probably be happier and more prosperous, and we'd have less poverty if we were like Finland. We'd definitely be, they always are coming in #1 in terms of education because they invest in it and they value their teachers. And so that's why Finland's at that particular point. I didn't know I'd be defending Finland. Sweden.
You raised it.
I know, I did raise it. And
Both standing up and we're just-
Or at least a little more projection.
sure, but I'm on my microphone, so
Okay. All right,
so I'll conclude with that.
thank you.
Finland's a great place. Don't hold it against them that they have great levels of income equality, and that they have a place where people are very happy, especially those who are refugees and immigrants, which is, I think, the truth in that.
And they may actually have better weather, too, than Minnesota.
They do, actually. Even above the Arctic Circle in Finland, it's more mild than here.
Dr. Kennedy spoke about the fact that income inequality doesn't necessarily mean that there is a harm to the common good. The question that I would ask is the widening income and wealth inequality, is that presumptively harmful to the common good? And if so, what can we do about it?
Well, I think that, well, there are two things I would say. First of all, it's one thing to talk about one country like the United States. One of the things that we've seen over the last couple of decades is a very dramatic increase in the number of people around the world who've moved into the middle class, which by any sense is a good thing, an advantage, and it's a diminishment in some respects of income inequality globally. Now, in a particular country, as I said earlier, I'm agnostic about the harmful results. I would disagree with Scott on his analysis of some of the social events, the French Revolution and so on, as being largely about, principally about, or even importantly about income inequality. There are a variety of other factors that play a role, particularly the distress of households with low income who may or may not be helped by a diminishment of income inequality. What they need is more resources, not a narrower band of range of incomes. So I'm not prepared to concede the presumptions, and I'd like to see more about precisely what harms are caused directly by income inequality.
Okay. I'm thinking of the book, Charles Murray, Coming Apart, and one of the things that he talks about is just the sociological disparity of experience that folks of lower income, the fact that marriages, and again, the nexus isn't necessarily proved that it's based on income inequality, but there is a very different experience of American life, and some commentators have pointed to the fact that this is why someone like President Trump was elected. You know, this might be part of what Scott is arguing, that
Pennsylvania was involved then too.
Right, well, all the Rust Belt, states went for him. So that would be my question: is there there seems to be an experience in America, a very different experience for those who are more educated, those who have more wealth. And are we getting to a point where without justice, whether you're going to concede that there's a justice issue, that we get to a point where it's just not tenable? Are we there at this point?
Well, let me comment quickly, and Scott may have something to add. I do want you to think about it this way. Would these people, people in, I think it's Fishtown, is that the name of the town from Murray's book?
Right.
Would these people in Fishtown be helped if the gap between the income that they have and the higher income households were simply reduced? Would they necessarily be helped? What if that money simply went to the government who chose to spend it on something unrelated to the problems of the people in Fishtown? They're not objecting to the gap in income, they're objecting to the insufficiency of the income that they have. That's the problem, not the span. So it seems to me that, that's what we need to focus on.
And what are some things that we can address toward that goal? I mean, trying to, what would be some specific areas that could help folks who?
Oh, we've got 30 seconds
Well,
or so. We can solve all those.
Yeah, well, but that's a,
well,
it's not an irrelevant question.
It's not an irrelevant question, but we need to know what's causing the gap. Is it an inability for them to find employment? Is it a lack of education? Is it that the jobs have moved to a different part of the country and they're not prepared for one reason or another to move to another part of the country? I think it's a very complex set of questions, and until we identify the causes, it's very hard for us to talk about remedies. But again, it's not simply reducing the income of higher level households that's going to help them.
Thank you. To Professor Taylor, would an asset tax as opposed to an income tax be preferable due to its focus on accumulated wealth versus an individual's work?
Thank you very much for that question. Asset tax is with the recent legislation, the federal estate and gift tax was effectively and essentially repealed, so we haven't done that. Minnesota retains its estate tax, and so Minnesota's continuing with that and raising some revenue with that. To look at a European country, one of a major source of revenue for the Netherlands is a net worth tax, so it looks at your net worth, the idea being that your ability to pay your taxes is a better measure of your net worth than your income. And when the United States ultimately decided to go with the income tax, I think it was a pragmatic decision, which is that if you have income, then you have something to pay your tax with.